The strip lighting in Bay 4 had been broken for 11 days. I knew because I'd filed the maintenance request myself twice, and both times it came back marked resolved in the system while the bulb kept stuttering overhead like it was trying to decide whether to commit. On the night of March 14th, I was standing under that light at 11:43 p.m., my third double shift in a row, trying to read a chart through eyes that felt like they'd been sandpapered, when the hand came out of nowhere and closed in my hair. Not a grab. A yank. Deliberate, angled, designed to pivot my skull toward the overhead monitor. Wrong dosage. The voice behind it was flat and surgical and utterly without apology. 12 milligrams, not 20. Would you like to explain to this patient's family why you almost sedated him into a coma? Or shall I? The bay went silent. 3 nurses. A resident. An orderly who had been pretending to restock the crash cart for the past 10 minutes, all of them watching. The chart shook in my hand, not from fear, I told myself, but from the fluorescent stutter making the numbers jump. And I looked at the dosage, looked at it again, and understood in the space between one heartbeat and the next that she was wrong. The order read 12. My transcription read 12. The discrepancy was in the pre-printed template that pharmacy had issued last Tuesday, with a formatting error that no one in this department had caught yet, no one except me, 4 hours ago, when I had flagged it in an email that was currently sitting unread in Dr. Harlow Voss's inbox. Dr. Harlow Voss, head of emergency surgery. The hand in my hair. The most decorated trauma surgeon in the city, and by consensus of every nurse on every floor, the most impossible human being currently drawing breath inside Mercy General Hospital. I said, very quietly, the template is wrong. The dosage is correct. I flagged it at 7:18 p.m. Check your email. She let go. I did not reach up to touch my hair. I did not look at the nurses. I looked at the monitor, at the patient's even respiratory trace, and I listened to the silence stretch itself thin across the bay. Then I heard something else, a sound that did not belong to the emergency department at 11:43 on a Tuesday night. It was the specific quality of attention, the way a room's air pressure shifts when someone in it is watching and has decided to remember everything they see. I turned my head toward Bay 4's glass partition and through the reinforced pane, past the corridor's steady midnight foot traffic. I found a pair of eyes. Still, dark, patient in the way that expensive, dangerous things are patient. The woman they belonged to stood in the corridor as though she had grown there. Charcoal, coat, one hand loose at her side, the other holding nothing. She was not a patient. She was not staff. Security had apparently not noticed her, or had noticed her and concluded that raising the subject was above their pay grade. She watched me for exactly 4 seconds. Then she looked at Dr. Harlow Voss, and something moved behind her eyes that I did not have the vocabulary for yet. I would learn it later. I would learn a great many things. If you're new here and this is your first time with us, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss where this goes. My name is Sable Wren. I am 28 years old, Omega designation, presented late at 22 in circumstances I have stopped describing to people who will use the information to feel sorry for me. I have worked at Mercy General for 3 years, the last 14 months in the emergency department. And in that time, I have been called, among other things, the Omega who should have gone into filing, a liability with a stethoscope, and, courtesy of Dr. Voss herself, during my first week, a warm body filling a nursing slot. I have also, in that same 14 months, caught 4 medication errors that would have killed patients, correctly triaged 2 presentations that the attending on duty had written off as anxiety, and memorized the pharmacokinetic profile of every sedative on the department's formulary. I did not do these things to prove anything to anyone. I did them because people's lives depended on someone in that building paying attention, and attention was the one thing I had always been able to afford. The night of March 14th continued the way bad nights continue, forward, without mercy, accumulating damage. Dr. Voss did not apologize. She pulled up her email in the corridor outside Bay 4 with the expression of someone defusing a bomb, and then walked away without a word, which at Mercy General passed for an apology from her. I finished my shift at 6 a.m., signed out, changed in the locker room, and was standing at the bus stop on Callaway Street, with my bag between my feet and my eyes closed against the gray morning when a car stopped at the curb. Not a taxi, not a rideshare with a light in the window. A car that was black and long and so clean it looked like it had never been in weather, driven by a man in a jacket that had the cut of a uniform without being one. He got out, came around, and held the rear door open without speaking. I said, "I think you have the wrong person." "Miss Wren," he did not phrase it as a question. My bag was between my feet. The bus was 4 minutes out. I had $43 in my account until Friday, and the kind of exhaustion that makes the inside of a warm car look like the answer to everything. None of that was why I got in. I got in because I recognized the scent that drifted from the interior when the door opened. Cold stone and black tea, with something underneath that I couldn't name yet. Something compressed and precise and old in the way that grief gets old when it's been refined into habit. I had caught the edges of it through the glass partition at 11:43 p.m., and my designation had filed it somewhere urgent without asking my permission. She was in the back seat. The woman from the corridor. Up close, she was angular in the specific way of people who have made their bodies into instruments. Nothing soft left, nothing that could be used. Her scent filled the car's enclosed space and pressed against my senses with the kind of authority that makes an Omega's nervous system recalibrate without asking. Alpha, the designation signal, was so clean and controlled it felt like a frequency rather than a smell, cold stone and black tea, and that thing underneath I still couldn't name. She was looking at her phone. She did not look up when I got in. "There is a portfolio on the seat beside you," she said. "Review it before we arrive." "Arrive where?" She looked up then. Her eyes were the color of dark water, and they had the quality I'd seen through the glass, that patient, measuring stillness. "My hospital. Mercy General is not my other hospital." A pause, brief and precise as a suture. "I am Cassian Noor. You have 30 minutes. Cassian Noor." The name took a moment to resolve into its full shape, and then it resolved all at once, and I sat very still. Cassian Noor, whose family had built the Noor Medical Foundation, which funded 3 of the city's trauma centers. Cassian Noor, who had restructured Mercy General's board 18 months ago, in a process the administration still referred to as the reorganization, in tones people usually reserve for natural disasters. Cassian Noor, whose other designation. The one the financial press had given her, the one the staff whispered, was the Iron Meridian, because every institution she touched was afterwards described as having a new north. I picked up the portfolio. It was a personnel file. My personnel file, current as of this morning, annotated in a handwriting so economical it was barely distinguishable from print. 3 years of performance reviews, medication error flags, triage assessments. 14 months of emergency department records. At the bottom, a single typed page with 3 lines on it. The first line said, "Director of Clinical Operations, Noor Foundation, East Side Campus." The second line named a salary that made my vision blur. The third line said, "Start date contingent on interview. Interview now." I closed the portfolio. 31 floors of city slid past the window. You watched her pull my hair, I said. Yes, and your response was to offer me a job. My response, Cassian Noor said, was to pull her employment file, read your incident reports, cross-reference your triage accuracy over 14 months, and conclude that Mercy General is wasting a resource it doesn't have the intelligence to identify. She returned to her phone. The hair was incidental. It wasn't incidental to me. She looked up again. Something shifted behind the still water of her eyes. Not softness, not yet, but the recognition of the distinction. No, she said, after a moment that had weight. I imagine it wasn't. The car turned onto Meridian Avenue, and I sat with the portfolio in my lap and the scent of cold stone and black tea pressing gently, persistently against the edges of everything I thought I knew about how my life was going to go. The East Side campus announced itself first in the quality of the light, a glass and steel atrium that caught the early morning sun and distributed it evenly across a lobby where the floors were pale limestone and the air smelled of climate control and something faintly floral. Nothing like the antiseptic and desperation smell of Mercy General's ER. 2 security personnel nodded at Cassian Noor as she crossed the threshold. Nodded, not waved through, not checked, nodded, the way you acknowledge a fact of geography. A woman in a blazer materialized with a tablet, walking 2 steps behind without being asked. I walked beside Cassian Noor and felt the lobby recalibrate around her presence the way the emergency bay had recalibrated when that hand landed in my hair. Sudden, total, no appeal. Director Chen held this position for 6 years, Cassian said, moving through the atrium without appearing to navigate it. He retired in January. His replacement lasted 9 days before requesting reassignment. The position requires someone who can read clinical data, manage a department of 43 staff, translate between medical and administrative, and remain functional under pressure that would dissolve most people. She stopped at the elevator. The doors opened before she touched a button. I watched you do 4 of those things simultaneously last night. You watched me get manhandled by my supervisor last night. I watched you absorb a public humiliation, identify the error in the precipitating cause, communicate it calmly, and then hold still while the person who humiliated you processed being wrong. The elevator closed around us. Her scent intensified in the enclosed space, cold stone and black tea, and beneath it, now close enough to catch. The thing I hadn't been able to name, something like cut cedar, clean split, and resinous, but darker at the core, like cedar after rain. Like something that had been standing in weather a long time. Most people either collapse or counterattack. You did neither. You waited. I was calculating whether I'd get fired if I said what I actually wanted to say. The edge of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, the ghost of the architecture of one. What did you want to say? Check your email, I said, was the polite version. The non-smile steadied. She looked at the elevator doors. The office has a window, she said, that faces east. You would have your own team, full clinical authority within your scope. I do not micromanage, and I do not tolerate being lied to. What do you tolerate? Very little, she said. So far, competence, honesty, and the specific kind of stubbornness that masquerades as patience. The doors opened. You'd be the first Omega director in the Foundation's history. The board will make noise about it. I will manage the board. The office did have a window. It faced east, and the city at 7:15 in the morning was a smear of rose and gray through the glass. And the desk was large enough to actually work at, and the chair behind it was the kind of chair that implies someone thought about what it would be like to sit in it for 12 hours. I stood in the doorway and looked at all of this and thought about my $43 and my bus route and the strip light in Bay 4 that had been broken for 11 days. I thought about Cassian Noor standing in the corridor at 11:43 with the specific quality of someone deciding. "Why were you at Mercy General last night?" I asked. A pause. Brief, but present. Board business. It was not a lie. Exactly. It had the shape of something true, with something important removed from its center. I noted this and did not push it, because I had learned, in 3 years of emergency medicine, that the questions worth asking are the ones you ask when the other person has a reason to answer. "I'll need a week's notice period," I said, "and the medication error documentation, the pharmacy template issue, needs to go to Mercy General's Clinical Governance Committee before I leave. I won't take a job and leave a hazard behind me." She looked at me for a moment with those dark, still eyes. Agreed, and I'd wanted in writing that the board's noise about my designation won't affect clinical decisions. Also agreed. "And," I said, and then stopped, because the third thing I wanted to say was personal, and I hadn't decided whether personal was a currency I could spend here yet. I was very aware of her scent, and of the way my own designation was doing something involuntary and inconvenient somewhere behind my sternum. "And?" she said, and I'd want to understand what actually happened to Director Chen's replacement in 9 days. Cassian Noor's expression did something I hadn't seen it do yet. It reorganized itself around what might, on a different face, have been respect. "I'll brief you tomorrow," she said. "Welcome to the Foundation, Miss Wren." I said yes. I took the job. I told myself it was because of the salary and the window and the clinical authority and the $43. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. The week of notice was its own ordeal. HR, handover documents, the pharmacy template corrections submitted to clinical governance with a paper trail that would survive my departure, and one meeting with Dr. Harlow Voss that I requested and that she kept for 6 minutes before deciding she had somewhere else to be. She did not apologize for the hair. She did tell me, as she was leaving, that the foundation position would eat me alive, which I filed alongside the rest of her assessments of my capabilities and left there. My best friend, Petra, who worked admissions at Mercy General and had the bedside manner of someone who had given up filtering approximately 4 years ago, took me to the noodle place on Garfield Street on my last night and said, flatly, "You got recruited by Cassian Noor." I was offered a position, yes, Cassian Noor, who the financial press calls the Iron Meridian. The same. Who has never once in her professional history been reported doing anything except winning. That seems accurate. Petra pointed at me with her chopsticks. "Sable, she came to the ER in the middle of the night and watched your supervisor pull your hair and then put you in her car. She also reviewed 14 months of performance data and cross-referenced my triage accuracy." "Sure," Petra said. "Sure she did. How does she smell?" I looked at my noodles. "Cedar," I said after a moment, "after rain." Petra put her chopsticks down. "Oh," she said, in the voice of someone watching a very predictable thing happen. "Oh, you are in so much trouble." Monday arrived the way new things arrive, all at once, without adequate warning. I took the bus to Meridian Avenue. Old habit, bus money being a different kind of math than $43 math, and I wasn't yet comfortable spending the salary I hadn't earned yet, and walked into the East Side campus atrium at 7:58 a.m. with my badge still stiff from the laminator and my first staff meeting in 45 minutes and the particular calibration of anxiety that presents in me as a very organized to-do list. Cassian Noor's office was on the 6th floor. Mine was on the 3rd. We would not, I had been told in the orientation documentation, interact daily, the foundation's operational structure kept clinical and executive functions in parallel rather than hierarchy. She owned the building. I ran the clinical team. These were separate lanes. This lasted until approximately 10:30 a.m. when she appeared in my doorway without knocking. She looked at my desk, which had in 2.5 hours acquired a color-coded master calendar, a flagged stack of the previous director's unresolved case files, a list of 43 staff names with designations and years of service noted beside each, and 3 separate documentation threads for the issues I'd identified in the morning's briefing. She looked at all of this and said nothing for a moment. "The Castellan Group audit," I said, without looking up from the file I was reading. Director Chen apparently agreed to an external review in November and never completed the preparation. The audit date is in 6 weeks. I'm aware. The documentation gaps are significant. I'll need Chen's original notes, if they exist, and access to the Q3 billing summaries. I'll have them sent by noon. She came into the office and picked up the list of staff names from the desk, not invasively, with a precision that suggested she understood exactly what she was picking up and why, and scanned it. "You've added notes. The overnight supervisor has been in the same grade for 7 years without a review cycle. The 2 senior nurses in the oncology suite are carrying a caseload that should be split across 3. The lead coordinator in intake has a skill set that's being underutilized by about 40%. I looked up. Chen was managing by attrition. Things that should have been fixed were being waited out. Cassian Noor set the list down. She looked at me with that dark, still quality that I was learning to parse. It had varieties, I was discovering, like weather had varieties. This variety was the same one she'd had in the elevator when I'd told her what I'd actually wanted to say to Dr. Voss. How long did it take you to identify all of this? 2.5 hours. Chen's replacement took 9 days to identify the audit issue and request reassignment. Chen's replacement was an administrator, I said. I'm a nurse. She stood in the center of my office with her hands loose at her sides and the winter light from my east-facing window cutting across the angles of her face, and the scent of cold stone and black tea and rain-wet cedar moved quietly in the air between us. My designation registered it and said something that had no words. I returned to the file. "Lunch," she said. "The building has a cafeteria on the 2nd floor. The food is adequate. I'll brief you on the Director Chen replacement situation at 12:30. You said tomorrow. I moved it. She left." I sat for a moment looking at the doorway where she had been, and then wrote Cassian, lunch, 12:30, Chen brief at the top of the to-do list that was also, I was gradually accepting, a list of reasons I was in trouble. The cafeteria was nearly empty at 12:30, the lunch rush having cleared and the afternoon shift not yet in rotation. She was already there when I arrived, at a corner table by the window with 2 trays and 2 cups of tea. Not coffee. Tea, which she had no way of knowing I preferred to coffee, or shouldn't have had a way of knowing, except that she was looking at her phone when I sat down and did not look up, but said, "The mug situation in your office." There were 2, an emergency department mug from Mercy General and a plain ceramic one. The plain one had the tea ring staining inside. I ordered accordingly. I sat down. I looked at the tea. I said, "Tell me about the replacement." She set her phone face down and told me. Director Chen's replacement had lasted 9 days because on day 6, at a board meeting to which the replacement had not been invited, a coalition of 3 board members, headed by a woman named Mirella Sokolov-Haynes, who sat on the Foundation's governing council and also, not incidentally, on the advisory board of Mercy General, had moved to restructure the Director of Clinical Operations role into a purely administrative function stripped of independent clinical authority. The motion had been proposed, debated, and tabled pending the new director's performance review. The replacement had received a courtesy call about the motion on day 7, read the room correctly, and requested reassignment by day 9. Sokolov Haynes, I said. She has had a preferred candidate for the position for 2 years. An administrator named Fenn. Quiet, credentialed, cooperative with the board's investment priorities. Investment priorities. The East Side campus, Cassian said, with a precision that made the words themselves feel like a temperature, generates a significant surplus in its physical therapy and elective imaging wings. Sokolov Haynes and her coalition have proposed for 3 consecutive fiscal years that clinical capacity in the acute and oncology departments be proportionally reduced to fund expansion of those units. She picked up her tea. Director Chen resisted this. Director Fenn, by design, would not. I looked at the food on the tray, a grain bowl, something with lentils, bread she had ordered without asking and gotten it right, warm, filling, nothing in it that required negotiation. This was the kind of thing that should have been unremarkable. It wasn't unremarkable. And you hired me instead, I said. I hired the most qualified candidate for the role, who will also, she said, have the clinical standing to make the reduction proposal politically untenable, because no board wants to be on record overriding a director of clinical operations who can cite specific patient outcome data. She looked at me. You are not a pawn, Miss Wren. You are genuinely the right person for this position. These things are not in conflict. I know, I said, and I did know. That was perhaps the unsettling thing, that I had sat in that car on Calloway Street and understood, even then, that she had assessed me correctly, that she had seen something real. The unsettling part was what it felt like to be seen correctly by Cassian Noor. Sokolov Haynes will move the moment she realizes I'm not temporary. She already has. Cassian's voice was level. She requested a meeting for Wednesday. I declined, and when she requests one with me, she will be polite. She will be thorough. She will offer you things, introductions, alliances, a quiet life on the board's good side. She set down the tea. Then she will find something about you that she can use. I broke the bread. The cafeteria hummed its quiet afternoon hum. Outside the window, Meridian Avenue went about its business in the pale March light. My designation, I said. Yes, she'll argue that an omega in this position is a risk, a liability, a board relations problem. Cassian's voice had not changed in register or volume. It had changed in something else, something underneath the words, like the thing beneath the cedar and the cold stone. The thing I couldn't name yet. She will make that argument publicly, and she will make it confidently, because she has made it before and been accommodated before. She has not made it to me before. I looked at her across the table. The still water eyes, the angular face with its economy of expression, the coat she wore even indoors, which I was beginning to think was not a fashion choice, but a kind of armor, one layer of distance maintained at all times. Why does it matter to you? I said. Specifically, not the position, not the clinical authority structure. Me, the question sat in the air between us. She picked up her phone, looked at it, set it down again, a gesture that in anyone else would have been evasion. In Cassian Noor it was, I was learning to read her. I could feel it happening the way you feel your eyes adjusting in a dim room, something like the specific difficulty of finding words for a thing you haven't put into words before. Because, she said, finally, I have stood in many rooms where someone was being made smaller than they are, and I have found, consistently, that the person being made smaller was the only one in the room worth the air. She met my eyes, and I am very tired of watching rooms do that. We ate our lunch. We talked about the audit. Her scent was rain-wet cedar and cold stone and black tea and the unnamed thing, and my designation was doing the thing I had told it to stop doing. And I had been in trouble since Monday morning, and I was only just beginning to understand how deep it went. Mirella Sokolov-Haynes wore powder blue. This was not incidental, I observed, in the weeks that followed, that it was a consistent choice. The blue of trustworthy institutions and good intentions, and nothing to worry about here. She had a smile that arrived slightly before her face did, and a voice calibrated to the register of someone delivering difficult news with great personal regret. She requested a meeting with me on Thursday. I accepted. She was, as Cassian had predicted, thorough. She arrived with a dossier of the Foundation's 5-year financial projections, 2 board members I recognized from the orientation documentation, and a set of what she called concerns about the Eastside campus's long-term clinical model. The concerns were fluent and specific and documented and constituted, when reduced to their mechanism, a polite invitation to be fen. I listened. I asked clarifying questions about the patient outcome data underlying the proposed reduction. She did not have it. I asked about the projected surplus from elective imaging expansion and what percentage was anticipated to remain within the campus versus flow to the Foundation's central operating fund. She had a figure that was demonstrably lower than the one in the Q3 summary I had spent the previous 2 evenings memorizing. The discrepancy, I said, is about $430,000 annually. Do you want me to walk through the calculation? Sokolov-Haynes looked at me over her powder blue lapels with an expression that arrived slightly after her face did and said, very pleasantly, Director Wren, I think what's most important here is that we find a model that works for everyone. The model that works for everyone, I said, is the one where the acute and oncology departments remain at current capacity, because the patient population they serve does not have the option of elective imaging timelines. I'm happy to prepare a formal position paper for the next board meeting. She stood up. She smiled. We'll look forward to reading it, she said, in the voice of someone who has just reclassified a problem from minor to significant. That evening, Cassian appeared in my office doorway again. This had, in the 3 weeks since I'd started, become a recurring pattern, not scheduled, not announced, but consistent enough that I had stopped being surprised by it and started being unsurprised by it, which was a different thing. She appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea and the expression of someone who had a specific question and was deciding how to ask it. How did it go? She said. She's going to move the restructuring motion at the next board meeting. I took the tea. Our fingers didn't touch when she passed it, but it was close enough that I was aware of the exact distance. I'm preparing a position paper. I need the full patient outcome data from the last 3 fiscal years, comparative against the reduction scenario. I'll have it pulled tonight. She sat down. She'd been doing this lately, sitting in the chair across from my desk, which had not been an original feature of our dynamic and which I had not commented on. She said something about your designation. It wasn't a question. She suggested, I said, that the board might feel more confident in the Director of Clinical Operations role if the role were held by someone with, and I'm quoting, broader stakeholder alignment experience. Cassian's voice was precise and perfectly level. Broader stakeholder alignment experience. Omega directors, I said, are apparently a perceived governance risk in large institutional settings. The room was very quiet. My scent did something I had stopped suppressing, something warm and certain that the air between us carried without asking my permission. What did you say? I said that Director Wren had independently identified a 2-year vendor fraud that my own finance team had missed, had prepared the documentation package that directly precipitated this review, and that if we were defining undue influence, we might begin with a board member who had been routing institutional funds to a family holding company. A pause, precise and brief as a suture. And then I provided the exact figure. I looked at her across the desk. $430,000 annually, the number I had walked Sokolov-Haynes through in powder blue. You had it memorized. You worked it out in front of me. You only heard it once. I pay attention, she said, to things that matter. The east-facing window held the last of the March light, and the office was warm and still, and the scent of rain-wet cedar and cold stone and black tea was everywhere in the air between us, and my own scent, pear and warm cotton. The signature I'd had since I was 22, and that I'd learned to dampen and deflect and keep small in professional spaces, sat in that air alongside it, undiminished, meeting it at the edges, and neither of us said anything about that yet. Cassian, I said. Sable, I need to finish the position paper. I know, she didn't move. I'll stay, if that's acceptable. I have files I can work on. It was not how people conducted professional relationships. It was also the most natural sentence I'd heard in 5 weeks. The chair is uncomfortable, I said. There's another one in the storeroom. She got up and got it herself, without asking where the storeroom was, which meant she had at some point made it her business to know the layout of a floor that was not hers. I did not comment on this. She set the second chair beside the desk rather than across it, opened her laptop, and worked without speaking. It was the best evening I'd had in recent memory, which updated my previous assessment, at 7:49 p.m. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen, looked at me, and said, "My head of security. Take it." She took it in the corridor. Through the glass, I watched her face do something controlled and precise, and then go very still in a way it hadn't gone still before. Not the managed stillness, the other kind, the kind that precedes a different kind of motion entirely. She came back in and said Sokolov-Haynes has a contact inside my security team. The documentation package, the original, before we sent it to council, was accessed at 5:17 p.m. I looked at her. Can they identify who? The access log shows my credentials, which means someone used your credentials, which means someone had them. Her voice had gone to a temperature I hadn't heard it reach before, not cold the way controlled cold is cold, but cold the way stone left outdoors in February is cold. All the way through. There are 4 people who have ever had emergency access to my login: my head of security, my personal assistant, my counsel, and she stopped. Who? I said. My sister, she said, very quietly manages Foundation communications. She has had access since the Foundation's founding. She and Sokolov-Haynes were at university together. The office held the silence for a moment. The east-facing window had gone dark. The city outside was the kind of dark that swallows details and leaves shapes. I said, "Is she still in the building?" Her access card shows she left at 5:48. Then we need to determine what she did with the documentation between 5:17 and 5:48, and whether any of it has been transferred outside council's secure channel. I was already at the keyboard. Cassian, sit down. We can trace the transfer. She sat down. She sat very close because the chair was beside the desk now and not across it, and her scent was cold all the way through, and underneath it, the grief had shifted into something adjacent. Not surprise, I realized, reading the micro-expressions that crossed her face while she looked at the screen. Not surprise. Recognition. The grief of a thing you have been afraid of for a long time arriving at last. You knew something was wrong with her, I said. I knew she was unhappy. Her voice was quiet. She wanted more authority within the foundation. I thought it was a family conversation, not a... She stopped. I was not paying attention. You were paying attention to everything else. I found the transfer log, 3 files, sent at 5:31 p.m. To an external address I recognized as a secondary alias Sokolov-Haynes had used in earlier council communications. There, she sent 3 files. The summary, the authorization chain, and the corporate registry pull. Those are the 3 that name the holding company explicitly. Yes, I sat back, which means Sokolov-Haynes has them, and she's going to claim they were obtained improperly. Even though they're authentic, authentication takes time. She only needs a news cycle. We sat with this. The weight of it. The specific weight of a problem that doesn't have a clean solution, only a better and a worse version of a bad night. The position paper, Cassian said. I looked at her. Your position paper cites the same corporate registry data. As a clinical operations document filed before tonight's board session, dated and time-stamped in the Foundation's system, her voice was returning, degree by degree, to the temperature I recognized. It was prepared independently, by you, in your documented clinical auditing capacity, before the security event. It is not subject to the access chain she would contest. I stared at her. It's in the Foundation's own filing system. Dated 14 days ago. She met my eyes. You were building the audit defense. You found it while you were building the audit defense. That is documented. That is exactly what happened, I said. Then we have independent chain of custody. She reached past me, pulled the position paper file, and checked the timestamp. 14 days ago, 7:43 p.m., clear in the system. Her access to the summary documentation changes nothing about your independent finding. Call your counsel. Call my counsel, she agreed. We were in that office until 11:15 p.m. Legal called 3 times, security called twice, and the head of communications, the one who was not Cassian's sister, called once to report that no story had broken yet, and the external email address had not shown further activity. By 10:30, we had a formal complaint filed with the Foundation's ethics board, a police report for the credentials breach, and a prepared statement that named the position paper's independent timestamp explicitly. At 11:15, Cassian closed her laptop and sat for a moment without moving. I had been watching her, in the intermittent way you watch someone when you are also doing 12 other things, the way you watch the one variable you haven't fully solved yet. She was tired. This was visible in her in a way that tiredness usually wasn't, which meant it was severe, which meant she was managing something she would normally not let show. When did you last eat something? I said. This morning. There's food in the break room on 2. There's always food there after 7. The night staff keeps it stocked. I stood up. Come on. She looked up at me, the dark, still water, with the current underneath. Miss Wren. Sable, I said, a beat. Sable, the way she said it, had the quality of something being set down carefully. You don't need to. I'm hungry, I said. You're going to keep me company. The break room on 2 was empty and lit with the particular warmth of night shift infrastructure, the kind of light that doesn't belong to any specific hour. Someone had left a pot of soup on the warming plate and a full plate of what looked like leftover rice and 3 kinds of wrapped sandwiches in the refrigerator. I made us each a bowl of soup and 2 cups of tea, the real kind, not the cafeteria version, and we sat at the break room table that was sized for 8 and used for 2, and ate without speaking for a few minutes. "Tell me about your mother," I said. She looked at her soup. Then she said, "She was a cardiologist. She practiced for 30 years. She was methodical, in the way that some doctors are methodical, the way that becomes a kind of art. She noticed things that other people filed under noise." A pause. "She used to say that medicine was a conversation with information, not a command over it, that the chart was talking to you if you were willing to listen. She sounds like someone I would have liked. She would have liked you." It was said simply, directly, with the confidence of someone who has made a specific assessment. She would have found your chart reading. She collected people who noticed things. She had a whole vocabulary for it. She called it signal attention. Her hands were around the tea mug. She would have said you had exceptional signal attention. "And you?" I said. She looked at me. "I notice things," she said. "Differently, I notice structures, systems, the way things hold together and where the pressure is, and what will crack first. A beat. I notice people less well." "You noticed me," I said. "You were hard to miss. I was getting my hair pulled in a fluorescent-lit emergency bay at midnight." "Before that," she said. "I was watching the bay for some time before that. You were triaging a patient in the next bay. There was a notation on the board that said low priority, walk in. You flagged it for escalation before the attending had reviewed it." She met my eyes. "You did it without being asked, without drawing attention to yourself. And you were right. I could see the patient from the corridor. You were right from 2 bays away, and no one in that department was looking at you. No one was looking." The story of my professional life, up until the moment it wasn't. "You read the 3-year chart review after that. I was already having the records pulled before Voss." Her voice did not change, but something compressed in it. Briefly, what she did was documented behavior. 3 prior complaints in her file, all resolved administratively. You were not the first. I know. The formal complaint I filed with Mercy General's board 2 days after the incident will have more weight, she said, given the pattern. I set down the tea. You filed a complaint. With documentation, without telling me. It was not about you, she said. It was about the pattern. The complaint is filed in the Foundation's capacity as a significant institutional stakeholder in Mercy General, her hands on the mug. But also, she said, more quietly, yes, it was also about you. The break room hummed its quiet night hum. The soup was warm. The light was the kind that doesn't belong to any specific hour. My scent and her scent had been in this small room long enough to find each other in the air, and I was aware of this with the whole of my nervous system and not trying to be unaware of it anymore. "Cassian," I said. "Yes, what is this?" The pause was not the elevator pause or the grief pause. It was a different kind, the kind that comes just before choosing. "I don't know the clinical term," she said. "There isn't one." "That's not what I'm asking." She looked at me across the small table, with the night shift light on her face and her hands around the mug, and the cold cedar of her scent warming at the edges, in a way it hadn't been warming before tonight, or before the past 5 weeks, or before the bus stop at Calloway Street, warming like cold wood warms when something sits beside it long enough. "I have been careful," she said, "for a very long time, about this specifically. I know. I am not good at it. The part where you let someone be present." without managing the distance. You brought me tea, I said. You memorized the number. You had the chair in the right room before I started. Those are small things. Those are the things, I said. The other kind, the large declarative kind, I don't need those. I was watching her in the way I'd learned to watch her, not for the surface, for the thing below the surface, the current in the still water. I need to know if this is mutual, or if I've been reading signal in the wrong register. She set the mug down. She looked at me with the dark eyes and the current, and she said, "It is mutual, simply, directly, without the careful architecture of a longer answer. I need you to understand. I don't know how to do this at the speed that," she stopped. "I have conditions, things that require time." "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "I like the job." The window faces east, the ghost of the architecture of a smile, and then the smile itself, a real one, brief and unguarded, the kind that changes a face entirely and disappears before you can be sure you saw it. "Then, we have time," she said. "We have time," I agreed. That night, on the bus home, I sat with the city moving past the window and the warmth of rain-wet cedar still in the air around me from where I'd been sitting, and I thought about signal and about the things you notice and the things you miss and the things that are, it turns out, sitting right next to you the whole time, waiting for you to look at the right column. I looked at the right column. The governance review moved with the particular momentum of documented wrongdoing in the hands of people who have good reason to want it resolved. Sokolov-Haynes's ethics referral expanded in the second week to a formal investigation. The police report on the credentials breach produced a conversation with Cassian's sister that lasted 6 hours and resulted in a resignation letter and a civil matter that Cassian handled with a precision that I recognized as grief management and did not press on. The 3 board members of the Sokolov-Haynes coalition recused from Foundation business pending the investigation outcome. The Castellan Group audit, conducted against the now complete documentation package, came back clean on everything except the vendor amendment, which was referred to the appropriate regulatory body on the 4th week, with the position paper appended as corroborating independent documentation. None of this was fast. None of it was easy. There were days when the 6th floor was loud in ways that were invisible from the outside. Phone calls taken in corners, counsel in the boardroom, the particular silence of an institution deciding which version of itself it was going to be. Through all of it, Cassian moved with the same economy of motion she'd had in the atrium on my first morning. But I had learned by now to read the thing under the motion, and I kept the second chair next to the desk and the tea in the break room, and I didn't make the distance comfortable for her when it wasn't earning anything. She noticed. Of course, she noticed. She noticed everything about how I managed the proximity. She noticed it, and she didn't mention it, which was how she negotiated things she was working up to. I recognized this from the way she'd managed the lunch meeting before naming what she was actually investigating. Patience as method. I was patient back. On a Wednesday in the 6th week, which was 4 days before the rescheduled board meeting, Cassian came to my office at the end of the day as she had been doing consistently, with 2 cups of tea. She set mine down, she kept hers, and she sat in the chair next to the desk. She did not open her laptop. After a moment she said, "I spoke to the ethics committee chair this morning. Sokolov-Haynes has agreed to resign from the council in exchange for a reduced referral scope. The vote will be formal at Thursday's session, but the outcome is certain." "Good," I said. "The position paper will be formally entered into the board minutes as a founding governance document. Your name on it. Better. The overnight supervisor you flagged in week 1 has been offered a promotion to senior clinical lead." A pause. She cried in HR. Apparently, the intake coordinator has been moved to a role that uses her actual skill set. Another pause. The oncology suite caseload has been restructured. I turned from the screen to look at her. Are you listing what I've done? I'm observing, she said, what 5 weeks of attention accomplishes in a system that's been managed by attrition. Her eyes on mine. You asked me in week 1 why you specifically. I gave you the structural answer. Yes, I have a different answer now. I waited. Because, she said, you look at the right column. Because you walked into a system and saw the people in it before you saw the structure. Because when I told you my mother died, you asked what she was like, not what happened afterward. She held the mug in both hands, not from cold, from the need to hold something, which I had learned was a tell she wasn't aware of. Because you are the only person who has ever told me to sit down in my own building and then been right about it. You did sit down. I know, the ghost of the smile, and then, Sable. Can I ask you something? Yes, the night in the break room. You asked if it was mutual. She met my eyes directly, with the full dark water weight of her attention. I gave you a half answer. You gave me an honest answer. I gave you a careful one. Her hands around the mug. The full answer is that I have been. She stopped, organized, continued. I notice you with a precision that I don't apply to other things. I have been noticing you since the corridor. I have been finding reasons to be in your building since your second day. I have reorganized my schedule 3 times to be available when you're available, and I have been doing this deliberately while also telling myself it was professional oversight, which is a brief pause. Internally inconsistent. Very, I agreed. And my scent, she said, with a directness that arrived slightly before the words like she'd rehearsed this part. I know what it does in your office. I know what yours does. I have been aware of this. So have I. And I don't. She stopped again. Shorter this time. I don't want to manage the distance anymore. I'm telling you that. The east-facing window had the late-day light in it, the same light that had been there since my first morning, and the city outside was the reliable city, going about its business, and Cassian Noor was sitting 2 feet away from me with her hands around a mug and her face open in a way I had not seen it open before. Not unguarded. She was too calibrated for unguarded, but chosen deliberately, specifically open. Okay, I said. Okay, don't manage the distance anymore. I turned fully to face her. I'll tell you if it's too much. I don't anticipate it being too much. She set the mug down. She looked at me, and the current in the still water moved, fully and clearly, like something surfacing. She reached out and touched my hand, the back of it, with 2 fingers. A contact so specific and deliberate it was the opposite of casual. And said, I need to go slowly. I know. I have. She turned her hand so her palm met mine. I have not been close to anyone since my mother died. Not in this way. I don't know if I've ever been. I don't know the right. She stopped. The control was real and present and working hard. I don't know the right vocabulary for it. You don't need the vocabulary, I said. You're doing fine. Her thumb moved across my palm once, and my whole nervous system said something that had no words. The scent of rain-wet cedar was everywhere and warm now, warm the whole way through. The cedar and the stone and the black tea, and underneath it something that was not grief anymore, but had been made from grief. Alchemized into something that was precisely Cassian Noor choosing to be here. Can I? She started. Yes, I said. She leaned forward and kissed me, once, slowly, with the precision that she applied to everything and the warmth that lived underneath everything. And it was the kind of kiss that is not an answer, but a question asked so carefully it means everything regardless. I kissed her back. Her free hand came up to my face, not to hold, just to be there, just to know the geography of it. When she pulled back, her eyes were open and the dark water was different, the current on the surface now, everything visible. "I'm going to get this wrong sometimes," she said. "So will I." "I'll manage the distance by accident. I'll notice," I said. "And I'll tell you." Her thumb was still on my palm. "All right," she said. "All right," I said. Outside the east-facing window, the city was going golden in the late light, and the evening was beginning, and we had time. The board session on Thursday was, by any institutional standard, unremarkable. The motion to confirm Sokolov Haney's resignation was passed. The restructuring motion she had been building was formally closed without being brought to vote, for want of a proposing member. The governance review findings were entered into the minutes. The Director of Clinical Operations position was confirmed as a clinical authority role, independent of the administrative structure. The language I had written in the position paper appeared in the board resolution verbatim, which Cassian noted afterward with the smallest possible expression of satisfaction. Afterward, in the corridor outside the boardroom, 3 board members I hadn't spoken to before came to introduce themselves. The chair of the Medical Advisory Committee shook my hand and said, in the voice of someone saying something carefully phrased but genuinely meant, "The pattern documentation you submitted was the best piece of clinical governance writing this board has seen in a decade." The vice chair said, less carefully, "I don't know how Chen missed the vendor thing." I said, "He wasn't looking at the right column," and she laughed, which meant she knew what that felt like. Cassian, across the corridor, was watching me. Not the way she'd watched me through the glass partition, not assessing, not measuring. Just watching. The way you watch something you know. She came over when the vice chair had moved on and stood beside me, and said, quietly, "The medical advisory chair wants to talk to you about the patient outcomes documentation for the oncology caseload restructure. Next month. I'll set it up." I told him your calendar was my calendar's administrative dependency, so he'd need to work through me. I looked at her. The ghost of the smile, not hidden, "Did you?" He seemed to find this clarifying. She looked straight ahead at the boardroom door. "I'm having dinner. Tonight, at my apartment. I would like you to come." "I'd like to come," I said. Her hand found mine, briefly, in the corridor, with 2 board members still within eyeline, this was significant. I understood it was significant. Cassian Noor did not make incidental gestures in institutional spaces, and then released. 7 o'clock, she said. "I'll cook. You'll cook. I know how to cook." I didn't say you didn't. Your tone implied uncertainty. My tone, I said, was interested surprise. There's a difference. "My mother taught me," she said, after a moment. She said it was the only useful domestic skill for people who were going to spend most of their lives in institutions. She was right about most things. She sounds like she was. 7 o'clock, she said again, and walked back toward the boardroom to speak with the finance committee chair, and I stood in the corridor with the warmth of 2 fingers on the back of my hand and the specific happiness of someone who has looked at the right column and found everything they were looking for. Her apartment was on the 31st floor of a building on Meridian Avenue, which I should have expected and somehow hadn't fully. Not the floor count, not the windows that ran wall to wall and turned the city into a painting, not the kitchen that had the quality of something designed by someone who intended to actually use it. Pale wood and good lighting, and a cooktop that had the specific seriousness of equipment that gets used. She was in it when I arrived, in clothes I hadn't seen her in before, No coat, no institutional armor, a dark sweater, and the posture of someone who was at home in the most literal sense. She had made something with lamb and preserved lemon, and a grain I didn't recognize that smelled like something I wanted to understand better. We ate at the table by the window, with the city arrayed below us, and talked about things that were not the foundation. She asked about my family. I have a younger sister, Ren, who I put through her second year of nursing school and who calls me every Thursday, and once described Mercy General as a factory for burning through good people. I asked about hers, a sister who had left, the family dynamic that had produced both of them, the parent who had built an empire first and been the architect second, the grief that had been structural, named in increments, set down in pieces. She would have done this, Cassian said, at some point in the middle of the lamb and the city. Cooked, made you sit at the table. Asked about Ren. I know, I said. I feel like I know her, from you. Her eyes did the thing with the current. She reached across the table and touched my hand, not briefly this time. After dinner, we stood at the window, the city in its nighttime configuration, all that dark water and light, and she was behind me, and her arms came around me from behind, not claiming, just encircling. The weight of her against my back, and her scent was warm cedar and black tea, and the unnamed thing that was now named, and I leaned into it and felt her exhale. I have been, she started. I know, I said. Lonely is the wrong word, alone by design. But, I know. I put my hands over hers where they crossed at my waist. I'm here. The city continued its business below us, and we stood there in the warmth of it, the two of us and the window and the 31st floor, and her chin came down to rest at the top of my head, and I thought about Bay 4 and the fluorescent stutter and the chart in my shaking hands and the eyes through the glass partition that had been patient in the way that expensive. Dangerous things are patient because they had been waiting for exactly this and hadn't known it yet. The scent gland at the side of her throat was warm under my fingers when I reached up. She went very still. Is this, I started. Yes, she said. No hesitation. Yes, I want to go slowly, I said. I need you to know that's what I want. Not, I want it to be right. Yes, her arms tightened. Once, yes, so do I. We stood at the window in the cedar and warmth, and the city held us in its ordinary ongoing life, and nothing that night was claimed or marked or bonded, and it was right. It was exactly right. 6 weeks is not a long time to know a person. It is, apparently, long enough to know the important things. I knew how she took her tea, and that she memorized numbers after hearing them once, and that she had cooked lamb with preserved lemon from her mother's recipe, and that she managed distance by accident when she was afraid and needed to be told so. I knew that the grief had been architectural, and that it was restructuring, slowly, and that she was going slowly, and I was going with her, and neither of us was in a hurry. I knew that she had filed a formal complaint about a hand in my hair on a night in March, without telling me, because some things you do simply because they are right, and because the person it happened to deserves it. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning, Cassian Noor did not appear in my office doorway. She appeared in my apartment doorway. She had her own key by then. A small, unremarkable thing she had asked for with the same directness she applied to everything, with a bag of groceries, and the expression of someone who had organized this in advance. I'm making breakfast, she said. You're making breakfast, I said, at 8 a.m. on a Saturday, in my apartment. Yes, okay, I said. She made breakfast. Eggs and good bread and coffee for her, and tea for me, without being asked, in the mug with the tea ring staining inside. We ate at my small table by my smaller window, and the morning was ordinary and warm and completely unlike everything that had come before, and also exactly like the continuation of it. Afterwards, she reached into the grocery bag. There were, I noticed, more groceries than breakfast required, and set a small box on the table. Dark wood. Unpretentious, the kind of box that came from a jeweler who understood that some people don't want the velvet. I looked at it. I looked at her. "I told you I'd get this wrong sometimes," she said. "I thought I would want more time. I thought I would," she stopped. Organized, I counted. From the bus stop on Calloway Street to this morning. 4 months and 9 days. I counted them because I do that. I count things I want to be precise about. Her hands were on the table, still, the way they were still when she had decided to be completely here. "You told me in week 3 that you had written to your landlord about the heat, and they hadn't responded, and you'd been sleeping in 2 sweaters. I had the heat looked at. The next day. I didn't tell you." "I know," I said. "It started working. I suspected." And the email to the pharmacy template committee at Mercy General. The one that's finally being implemented. I made a call. "I know." And Cassian. I put my hand over hers. "I know. I've been knowing." She looked at me. The current in the dark water, fully on the surface. "I have been paying attention to you," she said, "since a corridor in March. And I would like—" She stopped, started again, in the voice of someone choosing the words carefully because the words matter. "I would like to keep paying attention to you for a long time, in all the ways that means." I picked up the box. I opened it. The ring inside was not expensive generic. It was a narrow band with a single pale stone, cloudy, milky, catching the morning light in the specific way of something that has depth. "Moonstone," she said. "Your sister said. I called Ren. You called Ren. 3 weeks ago." She spoke for 45 minutes. It was very informative. The ghost of the smile. Held. She said your mother had a moonstone ring that you used to describe the way light moved through it. I was not going to cry at my small kitchen table on a Saturday morning. I was absolutely going to cry at my small kitchen table on a Saturday morning. "You called Ren," I said again. She also sent me a list of things I was required to know, which I have memorized. She reached across and took my hand and turned it palm up, the way she had in my office on the Wednesday in the 6th week. "I'm asking," she said. "With all of it. The distance I manage by accident, and the counting, and the inherited coldness, and the lamb recipe, and the grief that used to be structural. And She paused. "I'm asking with all of it." "Yes," I said. "Obviously, yes." She put the ring on my finger. It fit. Of course it fit. She had asked Ren, who had asked me 3 weeks ago about my ring size in a conversation I had thought was about our grandmother's jewelry. The moonstone caught the morning light and did the thing with the depth, and Cassian Noor sat across my small table from me, with her hands around mine and the dark water in her eyes completely still, in the way of something that has arrived. I kissed her in the morning light. She kissed me back, with the warmth that had always been there under the cold stone, all the way warm now, unguarded in the specific way of someone who has decided that warmth is not a liability and is testing the weight of that knowledge. The morning was ordinary and extraordinary, and we had time. The bonding ceremony, when it came, was small. Neither of us wanted the institutional version, Cassian because her relationship to institutions was occupational rather than personal, and me because I had spent 3 years being invisible in one and had no interest in performing my happiness for an audience. We held it at the East Side campus on a Sunday morning in August, when the east-facing windows in my office caught the early light, and turned the limestone floor gold. Petra was there, still blunt, now also crying. Ren flew in and immediately informed Cassian of 17 additional things she was required to know, which Cassian received with the particular patient attention she applied to things that mattered. Cassian's legal counsel attended and wept visibly, which she later described as a personal failing, which it was not. An elderly woman named Daphne, who had been Cassian's mother's research assistant for 12 years and had attended every significant event in Cassian's professional life since, sat in the back row and said, when Cassian and I stood together in the morning light, "Your mother would have found her." Just that, your mother would have found her. Cassian took a breath beside me that I felt through the new bond frequency like a chord resolving. I took her hand. The vows were short. She had written hers in the economical handwriting I recognized from the portfolio annotation, 12 lines, specific and precise and containing 3 callbacks to things I had mentioned in passing and not expected anyone to remember. I had written mine the night before in the coffee shop on Garfield Street, where Petra and I used to go after hard shifts, in the handwriting I've had since nursing school, and they contained the number 4 months and 9 days, which made her mouth do the full smile. The real one, the brief unguarded one, in front of witnesses. The claiming was consent-gated the way everything between us had always been consent-gated, which was to say, not like a gate, like a conversation. Her voice was low and certain. "Tell me to stop, and I will." I said, "Don't stop." The bond snapped into place like a frequency finding its signal, cold stone and black tea and rain-wet cedar, everywhere, warm through, and underneath it the thing that was not grief anymore, that had been made from grief into something that chose, every day, to be here. Afterward, Ren hugged Cassian for a long time without saying anything, which was, from Ren, the most significant possible endorsement. The investigation into Sokolov-Haynes concluded in September. The regulatory referral produced a formal finding of financial misconduct against the consulting entity registered to her brother-in-law. He was required to repay the surplus funds and barred from future foundation work. Sokolov-Haynes herself was removed from the Mercy General Advisory Board, and her council membership was terminated. The announcement ran in 2 financial outlets. Briefly, Dr. Harlow Voss at Mercy General was placed on administrative leave in April following the formal complaint the foundation had filed in March, a complaint that, once filed, had prompted 3 other staff members to file their own. She returned to practice 6 months later, in a different department under a supervision order. She did not apologize. She did, in November, correctly diagnose a presentation that 2 other attendings had missed, which was documented in the department record. I read about it in the governance minutes and thought about Signal and the things you notice and what you do with what you find. There is a mug in my office on the 3rd floor of the East Side campus, the plain ceramic one, with the T-ring staining inside, that she identified in my first week. There is a ring on my finger that catches the morning light in the specific way of something with depth. There is a second chair next to my desk that is always occupied at the end of the day, and there is an east-facing window, and the light through it in the early morning is exactly what she promised. She had told me once that she noticed structures, the way things hold together, where the pressure is, what will crack first. What she had not said, and what I had learned in the months since, was that she also noticed the things inside the structures, the small, specific things, the mug, the ring size, the number of days from a bus stop in March. She noticed me with the precision of someone who had been looking for a frequency and found it and intended to keep it. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. There is a version of this story where a woman stands in a corridor in the middle of the night and watches through glass and then walks away. She would have walked away before. She had walked away before from countless corridors because walking away was the architecture that had kept her intact. The version where she didn't walk away is this one, and it required only that I was still standing there when she decided. I was standing there. I am still standing here in the morning light, with the ring and the bond and the east-facing window, and the warmth that was made from grief but chose something else. I am seen in the way that changes the shape of the word permanent. That is what it means to be found by the right frequency, in the right corridor, at the right kind of wrong moment. The end. If this story sat with you, if you know the feeling of being in a room where no one was looking, and then one person was, subscribe to the channel, because the next story is waiting, and it starts somewhere just as unlikely. Which character are you rooting for in your own life right now? The one still standing in the corridor, or the one finally looking back? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know. Every story here is built for the ones who've been made to feel invisible, and there are many more to come. Until next time, take care of yourself and stay.